So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our Bushfire Response Program webinar. This is the first webinar as part of the program, and we're really excited to get things started today. Today's focus is on preparing learning communities for the upcoming bushfire season. My name's Ben Rogers, and I'm the Manager of Community Trauma at Emerging Minds, and I'll be facilitating the webinar today. If you haven't attended a session like this before, you'll notice that you won't be able to use your mic or webcam, and you'll be in listen-only mode. As I can see the numbers increasing, we'll have a large audience today. So rest assured, though, you will be able to ask questions as well as write comments in the question box. I might just orientate you to that first. You'll notice if you're on a desktop computer, if you look to the top right of your screen, you'll see a dashboard. So there'll be a question box you can write in there, as well as if you're on your phone, you'll be able to find that at the bottom of your screen. So before we begin, I'd like to take an opportunity to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land in which we meet. I personally would like to acknowledge the Kaurna people of the Adelaide Plains, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. And our panelists are joining us from across the country today. So they would also like to acknowledge the land in which they meet, the people of the Ngunnawal country, as well as the people of the Djawarung, Bunurong, and the Wurundjeri lands of the Kulin Nation. We wanted to remind everyone before we begin that your own well-being is a priority, and if any concerns arise as a result of this webinar, please refer to the wellbeing tools on the educators' resources through the BU website, as well as any services that are provided through your employee assistance program. Before we get started, it's really important to take a moment to remember that when we're talking about mental health in any context, including bushfire preparedness, it can affect us in different ways, and we'll come with our own unique experiences to the webinar today. So at any point, if you're feeling like you need to take a break, really acknowledge that, and rest assured that we'll be recording the webinar, so if you do take a break, you can come back and watch it at a later date. And you can see on the screen there's some contacts if you need to reach out as well, or also recommend that you reach out to your own networks available to you in your learning community. So if you can't tell, we're really excited to bring you this webinar today. This is the first of our 4 webinars that will be presented as part of the BU Bushfire Response Program. And you can see the learning objectives that we're aiming for today. So the first one, number 1 there, is looking at the benefits of preparing for bushfires. So we'll unpack that today. We'll also look at practical and psychological strategies which can support learning communities with preparing for bushfires, and ways in which children and young people can be involved in preparing for bushfires as well. Now, we want to make it as interactive as possible. And as mentioned, there's a question box that you can ask questions throughout. So we've got a team standing by who will be able to respond as best they can. And I'll be looking closely at the questions as well, and I'll be drawing them out for the Q&A at the second half of, as part of the second half of the webinar. So before we dive into meeting our panelists, just wanted to take a moment to give an overview of the Bushfire Response Program and what we're doing at the moment. So we're funded by the Federal Department of Education and the Department of Health to deliver mental health supports to schools and early learning services affected by the bushfires at the beginning of the year. So this is a program that's brought in 4 organisations. So we have Beyond Blue, Early Childhood Australia, Headspace, and Emerging Minds have come together. And I really like this visual representation actually, because it really embodies the kind of key components of the program. So you can see there at the start is the contact liaison officers. We have 25 amazing contact liaison officers across the country, and hopefully they're joining in today. Their role is to support early learning services in schools across bushfire affected areas. And the way they're doing that is through, firstly, trauma support and guidance. So using the guidance by drawing on key information and resources to assist educators with first understanding the impact of the bushfires, as well as building educators' capacity to support children and young people as part of the recovery process. And that middle pillar there around recovery planning is a key element as well. So CLOs are working closely with educators to identify short, medium and long-term activities as part of the recovery process. And finally, the last column there is looking at community support service mapping. So helping learning communities understand the complexities of referral pathways and what services are available to them. And this is a great picture. So we have 13 priority regions that we're supporting at the moment. So you can see it's from South Australia, Victoria, New South Wales and Queensland. So I wanted to extend a big hello and welcome to everyone joining from those regions. And we're also joined by educators from other regions across Australia as well. So a big welcome to you as well. So it's now my pleasure to introduce today's panelists. So welcome everyone. I thought before we dive into your presentations and get into the Q&A to follow, it would be really nice to explore what's drawn you into this type of work. And starting with you, Nicola, as Director of Acatlin, what's drawn your interest into the area of community trauma and natural disasters?
Yeah, thanks, Ben, and thanks for having me along today, and welcome to everybody. So I was drawn into this work as part of the work we do with Emerging Minds and the National Workforce Centre. My background is in working with children and young people impacted by interpersonal trauma, but delving into the world of community trauma over the last 3 years has been an amazing journey, I suppose, and just understanding the ripple effects of natural and other disasters and community trauma events like pandemics has been really fascinating to me in terms of the different levels of impact, but also the great resilience and capacity we have to support children and young people moving through these really challenging times.
Thank you, Nicola, and welcome. Bryony, as a researcher, what's led you into this area of bushfire preparedness?
So it was around 2007. I was in Tasmania doing my honours degree in psychology, and one of the academics at UTAS had an idea for a PhD project that would look at children's knowledge of bushfire risk in southeastern Australia. And even though I'd grown up in the bush myself, I knew nothing about bushfire, and it sounded interesting. I spent the first year doing fieldwork, interviewing children all over Tasmania about the bushfire risks in their communities. And I've been fascinated by children's knowledge of bushfire and their participation in bushfire risk reduction ever since. And I've been really lucky to be able to carry on with that work through the Bushfire and Natural Hazards CRC, which has funded us for many years now. And yeah, really excited to learn some of those things with you today.
Thanks, Bryony, and yeah, welcome to you. And Lee, as a principal at Harkaway Primary School, we can see you've just come out of class with the background there. What's drawn your curiosity into this area of bushfire preparedness or bushfire education?
Yeah, great. Thanks for your question, Ben, and thanks for having us on. Back in '83, we had Ash Wednesday, and I remember being really, really worried about my mates who I knew were in that area being affected by the bushfires. And I guess that's carried on with me through state emergency service and you know, working with CFA in different contexts through the SES. And as an educator, I want our kids not to have to go through what I did and have this aimless anxiety, but to be able to have the power to make a difference.
Thanks, Lee, and welcome to all of you. So on behalf of our audience, wanted to give you a big, very warm virtual welcome to the panelists. And we'll kick things off by starting with you, Nicola. So Nicola is going to introduce the area of bushfire preparedness, as well as some practical and psychological strategies that can be incorporated into learning communities. So thank you, Nicola.
Thanks, Ben. Yeah, so thanks for having me today. All of the information that I'm sharing with you today comes from the Community Trauma Toolkit, which hopefully a lot of you are aware of, which is available via the Emerging Minds website, and pulls together the kind of learnings of all the experts and lived experience in the field. So I wanted to just start with this graphic on timelines, which when I first worked in this space, it was really helpful for me to kind of orient myself to this space and think about communities being somewhere on this timeline at any one point in time. So either preparing for upcoming seasons of either fire or floods or other hazards, in the immediate aftermath, in the short-term or longer-term recovery, and underneath all of that is ongoing adversities such as drought as we conceptualise them. Now, this year's kind of thrown that up in the air a little bit, and I suppose the thing I wanted to acknowledge is a lot of the communities that we're living in at the moment are at multiple places on this timeline, and so we're all in preparedness as we come up to summer. We're living in an area that is bushfire prone or flood or storms and other natural hazards, as I mentioned. However, a lot of communities are also in the immediate aftermath of other incidents, critical incidents in school communities or broader communities, in the short term, couple of months after these events, and then obviously all of the regions that Ben spoke of earlier in the long term, which is 4 months plus post a disaster. So, and the ongoing experience of a pandemic. So it really, I suppose, helps to acknowledge that and realise why it feels like we're getting pulled in 100 different directions. It's because we are. But today we're here to talk about preparedness and the role of preparedness in not only equipping people to know what to do, but also to feel like they're psychologically and physically prepared for upcoming seasons. It's gone from theoretical to very real in a lot of our children's and young people's lives after living through, either witnessing directly or indirectly, all of the events over the last 12 months. So when we think about preparedness, the reason we want to talk about it and why we want to bring it to the fore is that we know that children are already thinking about it. As I said, perhaps before this year, it wasn't front of mind for everybody, but I think this year it's realistic and real to say it is. The kids and young people are living through the pandemic, but they're also living in the aftermath of some of the worst fires Australia has ever seen. And we know that living through that and witnessing it can produce feelings of anxiety and stress and worry in children, as well as grief. They are very resilient. We talk about resilience in kids a lot, but resilience does not mean not impacted. It means that we are able to move on following adversity. So we really need to think about how to support kids through their experiences and to move from and learn from them. And the preparedness work that we're going to talk about today is really significant in helping build resilience, because it helps kids build their sense of agency, and they have a very important role to cope in terms of how to cope and how to prepare, and Bryony and Lee will talk about that in more detail. And in terms of in the school environment, working with the children and young people in your community about preparedness psychologically and physically can really help them feel equipped and more able to cope in the actual circumstance of another disaster or overwhelming event. So psychological preparedness is what it sounds like, getting yourself in the mindset of how you might cope in an emergency. Having a sense of ability to cope can really mitigate the impacts of exposure to adversity and the long-term impacts. The high five model that is widely available can really provide a helpful framework for working with children and young people to think about what to do in the event of an emergency. And we would recommend that the adults and the educators in communities work through this model themselves and then share it as appropriate through agent development with the kids and young people that they work with. So it's about understanding the risks of where you live and your community and those around you, connecting with others, knowing who else is around and who can help in a circumstance. The third one's really important, identifying the strengths that we already have. So we do have the capacity now, because unfortunately most kids have been through a fairly frightening time over the last 12 months, even if it's just watching it from afar or being exposed to smoke and so forth, or hearing about a pandemic. What do they know? What do they have in their repertoire to be able to manage stress and worry, identify how they feel it in their body and what skills they have to be able to manage it, and going over those skills and reiterating them when they're not stressed really equips them better to be able to cope in the event of another frightening situation. Learning about what to do in an emergency and looking after your life is not just about in the event, like how to keep yourself safe in a critical situation, but how to look after your well-being in terms of, even if you are exposed to a really frightening event or a disaster, how do you look after your well-being and move forward to find other strengths so it doesn't go on to dominate you and how you're feeling about your life and your future. The AIM approach is developed by the Australian Psychological Society, so it's another nice simple model that can be used by educators and families and children alike. And it's really about bringing to fore the conversations that we know what to expect if we're in a crisis situation, that you will be worried, that you will be frightened, that you will be anxious in those situations, that you might have thoughts that will go through your head that are catastrophizing or not very helpful. And once we learn how best to manage them and get some strategies in our toolkit around how to manage feeling very overwhelmed, how we notice it in our body, do we use our deep breathing techniques, do we know grounding techniques, how do we notice our thoughts if they're starting to spiral, what can we do about them? So you're starting to feel like you have capacity and ability to cope in a stressful situation. As I said, if we can practice those skills and embed them and feel like we have that, we're much more likely to be able to actually implement those strategies when we are overwhelmed. Kids will need support with that. Kids who've had more adversity or more frightening experiences might need additional support, but educators know that. They're very well placed to be able to know exactly what supports kids do need that are in their classes and in their communities. Practical preparation is what it sounds like. Again, educators are very familiar with this, but actually working through it and letting children and young people know what's in place is very reassuring, that know what the plans are, what the evacuation plans are, what people should have in the case of an emergency in terms of contacts, and talking to kids about what's in place in the school, what's in place do they have at home, because we never know when disasters are going to strike. They might be in school term, they might be outside of it. So working with them to make them feel equipped, where to get information. We learned a lot over the last summer about where kids accessed information, what kind of apps they use, whether that be about fire threat or air quality. So they have a lot of knowledge themselves. But as Bryony and Lee will go on to talk about, it's really important to understand what they know and what they don't know, or what they might be misinformed about, so we can make sure that they're getting the accurate information. And so really we're talking about psychological preparedness and practical preparedness. They fit together seamlessly in that one really is supported by the other. So you can't feel psychologically prepared if you don't know practically what you need to do. And you can be practically prepared, but if you have no strategies for managing stress and overwhelm, then the best laid plans can fall apart. So the last point I want to raise, and it will be built on, as I said, is an understandable resistance sometimes as adults have about talking to children about frightening subjects. It could be disasters, it could be COVID, it could be divorce, any of those sorts of things. Adults often, their natural instinct is to protect children from frightening events. However, what we do know is that talking to children about disaster preparedness doesn't make them feel more anxious. It actually makes them feel less anxious because they feel more prepared and more equipped. How we talk to them is important. When we talk to them is important. And when we allow them to ask questions and clarify things, it leads to them feeling more capable and more in control. But we need to do it when we can do it. So we can't do it when we're feeling overwhelmed or stressed. That's why the preparedness is so important. So we're not having these conversations in the midst of a disaster for the first time. It's much easier to support kids psychologically to implement a plan if we've talked to them before we're in the midst of having to use it. Kids, like anything, need to go over plans more than once, often, to get reassurance, to get clarification. But setting up, I suppose, an atmosphere where kids can ask questions, can feel equipped, can understand that the adults know what's going on and what role they have to play, really is best practice in terms of supporting them and us in terms of feeling best placed as we go into another summer, which we know is already causing some anxieties. We're reaching anniversaries and days are warming up and windy. All of those things have already started to happen, as you guys are well aware. So that's just setting the overall framework of why we might talk about preparedness and how psychological and practical preparedness go hand in hand. And I'm going to hand over now to Bryony, who's going to take into a bit more detail about her work in this area. So thanks, Bryony.
Thanks so much, Nicola, and thank you to Beyond Blue and Emerging Minds for this really great opportunity to share some of what we've learned through our research with children and schools. So probably the most important thing we've learned is that most children want access to knowledge and information about bushfire. Over the last decade or so, I've interviewed hundreds of children around Australia about bushfire hazards and disasters, and I'm constantly amazed by their enthusiasm for discussing what they know, what they're curious about, what concerns them, and what can be done to keep their community safe. My colleagues in the fire agencies often lament how difficult it is to engage adult community members in discussions about bushfire, and I keep telling them that they'll never have that problem with children. When children become aware of the potential for a bushfire to occur in the area, or they experience a bushfire emergency, they want to know what they can do to protect themselves, their families, and the things they value. And when we provide children with access to knowledge and information, and we support them to use that knowledge and information to take protective action, they actually feel less afraid of bushfires. So while our instinct might be to shield children from the realities of living in a bushfire-prone environment, the research tells us that providing children with knowledge and information actually has a really positive impact on their sense of safety and security. But when we're providing children with access to knowledge and information, we need to remember that they're not blank slates. And a major finding of my research across different studies in different states, in rural areas, and on the peri-urban fringe is that children always come to the topic of bushfire with their own theories about how bushfires behave in the landscape and how they impact upon people, property, and the environment. When we're engaging with children in learning and action for bushfire safety, it's really important to spend time in genuine dialogue with them so that we can understand their existing theories, because those theories have a profound influence on how they perceive bushfire risk and how they interpret new information. So, for example, I once interviewed a 10-year-old girl from Woodend, which is a high bushfire risk location in Victoria's Macedon Ranges. And her family were planning to stay and defend their property, and her mum had delegated her the job of filling up the bath. When I asked her why she had to fill up the bath, she told me it was because if a bushfire came towards the bathroom, the water in the bath would stop it from spreading through the house. One of the most important misconceptions children have about bushfires is that they travel in this really predictable kind of linear way via direct flame contact, and that a non-combustible barrier such as a brick wall or a road or a swimming pool, or in this case a bathtub of water, will prevent the fire from spreading. And so while her parents actually wanted her to fill up the bathtub so that they would have a ready supply of water to throw on spot fires, she'd constructed her own rationale based on a pre-existing misconception about bushfire behaviour. So when I'm doing bushfire research with children or working on the design of bushfire education programs or materials, I put a really strong emphasis on starting where the child is at, which requires understanding their existing theories, misconceptions, knowledge gaps, and working with them from that point to bring them towards a more accurate understanding. While children might come to the topic of bushfire with various misconceptions and knowledge gaps, they do have the capacity to understand bushfire risk in quite sophisticated ways, but we need to scaffold their learning. So what you can see on that, in that first box on the slide there, is the international equation for disaster risk. Hazard times exposure times vulnerability divided by capacity. And this equation actually provides a really valuable framework for effective teaching and learning. So we start with the hazard, which is the bushfire itself. And I've already described one of the misconceptions that children have about bushfire behaviour, but there's a multitude of them. Learning the basics of bushfire behaviour, for example, how bushfires start and how fuel, weather and topography influence fire spread in the landscape, is actually something that children really enjoy, but also when they have a bit of an understanding of how bushfires start and spread, they're in a much better position to understand exposure. And so exposure is where we have people, houses and other assets in bushfire prone areas. And while children usually have a pretty accurate perception about the likelihood of a bushfire occurring in their locality, they can tend to underestimate the exposure for their own property, particularly if they're living in a more built-up area. Learning how bushfires can spread via burning embers and spot fires can help children to form a more accurate perception of their exposure. But in most Australian states and territories, there are also online mapping tools which provide really reliable information about the levels of exposure for specific locations. So for example, last year, some of Lee's grade 5 students at Harkaway figured out how they could use the online Vic Plan mapping tool to determine if their property had a high, medium or low level of bushfire exposure. And this was such a valuable learning activity, as one of the students exclaimed when she found her property on the map, "Oh my God, I had no idea I was in a bushfire prone area because we are just surrounded by other houses. I'm going to pay so much more attention to bushfire stuff now." And then we have vulnerability, which refers to the conditions that increase the susceptibility of exposed people, houses, livelihoods, and other assets to damage and harm. Children are actually really good at identifying vulnerability in their households, schools and communities. They often recognise that because they haven't had access to knowledge and information, they lack an understanding of how to protect themselves from bushfire hazards. They also know that not everyone has the financial resources to fix up their house so that it will withstand bushfire impacts. And they're highly aware that very young children, elderly people, people with disabilities, and other groups of people may not be able to respond safely to a bushfire threat on their own. And then we have capacity, which is the combination of all the knowledge, skills, strengths and resources available in a community to reduce bushfire risk through prevention, mitigation and preparedness. What we really want children to understand about capacity is that everyone has a really valuable contribution to make to risk reduction. Children often assume that risk reduction is the responsibility of fire brigades and parents and teachers and other adults in their community, and that's true. But for risk reduction strategies to be effective, everyone needs to be involved so that everyone's needs are taken into account, and this includes children. The best thing about doing this work with children is that moment when they identify a problem others have overlooked, or they come up with a really innovative, creative solution to a complex or long-standing issue, and they realise that they really do have the capacity to make a difference. When we're working with children on bushfire safety projects, we really try to emphasise that while they may need help to better understand some of the more technical aspects of bushfire risk and risk reduction, they are experts in their own lives, and that expertise is absolutely fundamental to developing effective risk reduction strategies that will keep them safe and protect the things that they value. Children have expert knowledge of their daily routines and activities. So, for example, some children walk to and from school with their siblings or a group of friends, and they catch public transport. Some children have parents who work full time, so after school and during school holidays, they're looked after by a babysitter or an older sibling. Some children's parents are separated, so they might move between two different households during the week. And children know these routines and activities like the back of their hand, and that knowledge is so important for developing robust emergency plans that take different contingencies into account. Children also know what household and community assets are valued and cherished. Ask any child with a pet what they would most want to save from the impacts of a bushfire, and they will most likely tell you that it's their pet. I once interviewed a 9-year-old boy in Huonville in Tasmania who told me that he was really worried about what might happen to his goats if his family had to evacuate. And I asked him what his goats meant to him, and he said they were like his brothers. Children have expert knowledge of relatives, friends and neighbours who might be vulnerable or have limited capacity to respond to a bushfire event without support. So when we're researching bushfire safety programs in schools and we interview parents, they'll often tell us things like how their children have prompted them to make sure Gran and Grandpa's emergency plan is up to date, or to check in on an elderly neighbour on a high fire danger day. Children also have critical insights into the social, economic and cultural factors that can impede bushfire planning and preparedness. So I've interviewed children in rental properties who have rightly pointed out that there's limits to what you can do in terms of vegetation management and structural mitigation when it's not your house. I've once interviewed a 9-year-old girl in Macedon whose adult family members couldn't agree on whether they would stay and defend their property or leave early. And she told me that any discussion about the bushfire plan usually ended in a huge argument. And she was really concerned because bushfire season was approaching and they still hadn't resolved the issue. So inclusive bushfire education that empowers children to take action requires that we acknowledge these social, economic and cultural barriers to bushfire planning and preparedness, and that we provide children with at least some degree of voice and choice in what they might do to reduce bushfire risk in their own context. So when we start with children where they're at and we provide them with opportunities to develop their understanding of bushfire risk and risk reduction, and we encourage them to tap into their own expert knowledge of their households and communities, they can make really valuable contributions to bushfire safety. So first of all, children are really fantastic bushfire educators. At Strathewen Primary School, children have made films and books to educate their community about fire danger ratings, bushfire planning and preparedness, and the fire history of the local area. And at Harkaway, the grade 5-6 students have created films and websites and games and interactive workshops to teach the grade 3-4s about what they can do to be better prepared for bushfire season. When children are given the opportunity to actively participate in bushfire emergency planning at home or at school, their contributions really enhance the quality of emergency plans. Children often pick up on things that their parents or teachers have overlooked. So for example, I once interviewed a 5-year-old girl in the Perth Hills who realised that her family didn't have a plan for evacuating their 10 budgies that lived in an aviary in the backyard. And when she realised this, she was mortified. So we consulted with a vet about what she could do to get them out safely. And third, when children have had the opportunity to develop their understanding and take an active role in bushfire safety activities, they often have profound insights into how adults can make bushfire education programs and initiatives for children more engaging, relevant and meaningful. So don't ever be afraid to ask your students for feedback on how you can improve your own practice. So finally, bushfire risk is a really complex phenomenon, and thinking about it can be really daunting for children and adults alike. But for many years, after many years of working with children and school communities, I'm convinced that we should always begin with the hypothesis that any subject can be taught in some intellectually honest form to any child at any stage of development. So I'll leave that with you as a provocation and hand over to Lee in Harkaway, who's going to provide us with a principal's perspective. Thank you so much, Lee.
Well, thank you, Bryony, and Nicola as well. And obviously the Beyond Blue, Emerging Minds and BU team. How extraordinary that you guys are all out here at the end of what's probably been a crazy day back in here in Victoria. We're back in face-to-face. So thank you for making that effort to actually put yourself in this place today. Look, we've only got a pretty short time to actually, what I'm hoping is to really just inspire a heap of questions. So I'm going to talk about a few things, particularly from a learner agency perspective, but with the hope that we can inspire a few questions at the end of this little talk. Two things to kick off with, though, when we're talking about child-centred disaster risk reduction in the classroom. One, and Nicola pointed to that early on, is that taboo subject. You know, do we broach this with a fear of causing anxiety? or do we actually tackle it front on? And so if we're going to be authentic about this, let's face it, we're not teaching sex ed. It's not that awkward. And yes, it may be a challenge for us to feel comfortable about it, but it is, we can't avoid the anxiety. So it is a taboo subject in many communities, but actually it's one that is absolutely crucial to get on board with. And the second really important point to kick off with, this is not about teaching bushfire safety preparation. It's about making sure that we do whatever it takes for the learning to happen about bushfire safety preparation. So yeah, we can rip off those black line masters, we can shove the kids some homework about do a bushfire plan, hand it in on Friday, give them a happy sticker. Well, that's the teaching, but we want to make sure they've done the learning. And that way we know that they see themselves as kids who are actually able to take action to reduce the risks around them and actually have agency for the safety of people around them as well, including their families. So in order to do that kind of flip from a teaching focus to a learning focus, we need to actually have the philosophy of education there in the background to begin with. You know, what's your school there for in the first place? Now, we can zip right through it. In the old days, schools produced workers. It feels like now that, you know, schools produce data. But from where we're coming from, in this perspective, schools afford agency. We're giving kids the power to act. There's some confusion between schooling and learning, and this conversation is not about schooling, it's all about the learning. And let's face it, shouldn't schools be all about teaching kids to learn? If nothing else, we know that's exactly what we're doing, you know, in this day and age. And 2020 probably exemplifies that more than ever before. So having a philosophy of education that accounts for learner agency is simply these two things. In your classroom, do you have a culture where your kids are making rules? And are they allocating resources? Do they have a say in the way things are shaped? So there's a lot of work, Project Zero over on Ricard, all these cultures, thinking cultures in classrooms, and there's a lot of work around this at the moment. It's just the way you greet kids at the door, the way that you treat kids with dignity, the way that you engage them with your questions, forever asking, what makes you say that? Or tell me more about that, rather than just keep this discourse of knowledge into blank slates. We recognise kids are not blank slates. So what are our students producing to you know, help educate others? And that's where this the project has come from in Harkaway Primary School. We're positioning our kids as experts. There's no more important time in Australia right now than actually our kids knowing how to effectively learn about this stuff. So for us, there's no more important time than being experts, excellent at causing this learning to happen. We want to give it the best possible go of our kids learning about disaster risk reduction. So how, this is the provocation, how do we curate learning opportunities so that kids can take action to reduce the risks around them? And I guess a part of that is a philosophy that's very live and active in so many schools now, that nothing is taught until something is learned, and nothing is learned until you've done something with it. Just dwell on that for a moment, and I've put up some examples there. For the sake of time, I won't go into them. What we did was set up a Bushfire Safety Committee, and you can read all about their manifesto, which was they're like, hey, we've got something to say about child-centred disaster risk reduction, and say it they did. And we gave them the power to produce that and to say that, to become experts on being a kid in dealing with these issues. So before we had this committee, we had a culture where we have our discovery learning. We use an inquiry model, you know, that is grounded in the Stanford University Agile, you know, Agile design methodology. Our kids were running workshops, you know, every year. Our senior kids would go down their junior grades, and we have this model here where we have students who are modelling what it means to be a Harkaway learner and students who are mimicking what it means to be a Harkaway learner. So we have this process of induction right across from prep to six, is apprenticeship model, I guess you call it, of learning. And part of that is taking risks, and part of that is having something to say. So our key message here is that we're talking about agency and the power to act. You know, we want to give our kids the power to act. If children don't have this naturally, which they don't, children want to, then we need to give them practice at having and developing this agency, this self-efficacy, this belief in themselves that they can actually learn the skills and the knowledge and the actions they need to take to actually be safe and cause others to be safe during bushfire safety. So allowing children to experience this in small successes is absolutely critical. So here's what we did. our Bushfire Safety Committee did a heap of stuff around producing a product that others can use to teach about bushfire safety. So that's a little bit confusing. Normally we just say, make a poster, kids hold up the poster, put a little sticker on it, yay, well done. But in this case, the kids had to design a product that then could be used by someone else to teach bushfire safety and preparedness. And that was quite different. That put a whole, they had to develop a user profile, they had to develop questions of empathy, they were talking to kids in Gembrook who had recently experienced bushfire impact on them. They had to reach out to experts, to veterinarians, to wildfire safety officers. They had to talk with CFA. They chatting in with CSIRO experts. They had to position themselves to become experts and then develop something with that knowledge that they had actually attained. So this actually allowed our kids to really dive in and come up with some really creative stuff. I had no idea at the beginning what the end would look like. So that holding things loosely in your hand was absolutely critical for me as a teacher, to have the process, fall in love with the process, to be intimate with the process, but actually the product had to take care of itself at the end. So at the end of all of this, our kids were aware of the product, of the process, I should say, and they used it to actually produce all these different artifacts. So, for example, they made the web pages, they ran live events. Of course, there were the posters, there were the scratch computer games that kids were making. They were using maps and producing maps, and they developed and understood all this language around bushfire safety. Kids were, making on a Code Red Day, a go zone, like they could contacting organisations that would maybe give families a discount to come there during a day. Then, after all that, here they are as experts presenting at RMIT University to master's degree students around what they had learned in their own context as experts. Their self-efficacy after that, their belief in themselves, skyrocket, amazing, absolutely phenomenal. So that's the point. We wanted to create the conditions for learning to happen, and learning it did. Out of all of this, what we want is self-efficacy for our kids. So we want our children at the end of this process to go, I'm someone who knows what actions to take to be able to reduce the risks around me and for others around me. So we used Albert Bandura's 4 sources of self-efficacy for that. And I'll just talk to these really briefly. There's heaps of examples for each of these 4 things, but I want to make them pretty clear, and then hopefully you can throw some questions in the chat there. Performance outcomes. So we all know a little bit of success breeds success, and that's what we want. So for our kids to jump on the computer, talk to the possum lady, ask about how we can make pouches for possums caught in, in bushfire season. Awesome. Little bit of success, and then they can take it and run with it. Reach out to a veterinarian. How do we look after horses? How do we prepare for horses through bushfire season? What are we going to do for wombats? How does I live just outside a bushfire zone? Am I likely to be impacted? So these little bits of success then lead the kids to go down that model, that inquiry model, and actually start to rapid prototype a product, test it out, and then and see how they go. And gosh, it was fun. It was manic. It was just chaos. But gosh, at the end of it all, it was huge fun. So the vicarious experiences are these ideas that if kids see another kid, someone they can relate to, achieving success, well, they can do that. Well, I can do that. A good example is like one little group wants to do a Save the Wombats plan. All of a sudden, everyone wants to do Save the Wombats. And then, we can work through it and refine it, and people do their different things. So just seeing others experience success, we know, is a source of self-efficacy. The physiological physiological feedback, that's a big mouthful at the end of the day. We're talking before about the AIM and the 5 strategy. Same thing, it feels good to feel good. So when our kids experience that little bit of success, they feel good about that, and that spurs them on. So they're starting to believe, yeah, we've got this, we can do this, I can do this, and then working with others who can do it as well. And simply that specific feedback, okay, that last one being the verbal persuasion, really awesome. So when they do hold up their posters that they're going to give to someone else to use to teach about being bushfire safe, then they're getting feedback. Your heading looks fantastic. It's big enough to me to read. I love the way you've done the outlining on it. I can see it really clearly, and I can engage with the content. So 4 really big things you can start with tomorrow, and You know, we've done that in maths classes. We're now planning for maths courses of self-efficacy and everywhere else. Just in the last 1 minute, I want to wrap up with, you know, a bit of a call to action. Number one, be really deliberate about your culture in your classroom, about being risk takers, about you know, the way that we, who does most of the talking. Am I as the teacher, which generally is me doing most of the talking, and I give my kids a stopwatch now. They know I've got 10 minutes and they respectfully can ask for me to stop talking so they can get on with it. Number two, knowing how to help. So having people like Dr. Bryony and others around that are resources, obviously the CFA website and CSIRO, there are so many resources that we can turn to know how to help, and particularly in the mental health space right now, the whole BU project, you know, is absolutely critical to being able to support our kids in all of this. A really, really important thing that we don't do well in Victoria, and that's teach meets. I know there's a few people out there that do really well, like a hub bringing teachers together, like the primary years program, they do this often, but just generally, as us as teachers getting together and just talking about this stuff. How are you, what did you do up in St. Ives about, you know, your project? How did that go? What worked? We know that collaborative stuff inside the school works. Well, it's manifold when we do it between schools and across the nation as well. Super important and really easy to do. And the fourth bit is get your kids to do the same thing. We're part of a group called Kids Teaching Kids, you can look it up. And Kids Teaching Kids is that model where, well, the kids just present to each other what they're doing to help their environment. Well, we can be doing this around bushfire safety as well. So there's absolutely nothing stopping us from getting together virtually and hopefully physically down the track and getting our kids sharing their learning, or just merely listening to other kids share about their learning. And then that's that first step in that self-efficacy development. Thanks for listening, and back to you, Ben. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Lee. And thanks to Bryony and Nicola as well, and they'll join me now for the Q&A. You'll shared some really great insights, practical strategies, as well as key ways in which children and young people can have agency in this area. And we've got about just under 15 minutes, so we might dive straight into the questions. And Bryony, something that came up, particularly with your quote that you put on at the end there, was around engaging the younger audience, so young children. What kind of advice do you give to early childhood workers or anyone in the early childhood space?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and that's one of the reasons I put that quote up at the end. I've interviewed children as young as 5 and 6 about bushfire hazards and disasters. They're very capable of engaging in those conversations around bushfire planning. I think if your school is located in a high bushfire risk area, then that's a really great opportunity to provide a really safe space to explore some of the issues around bushfire evacuation and sheltering in place with those younger students. But what I'd really like to see happening is that we actually start to take a whole school approach to bushfire safety education. And we actually don't even start with bushfire hazards and disasters. We start with the role of bushfire in our environment and with fire ecology and with Indigenous fire stewardship, and that we start that with kinder kids at Bush Kinder and, you know, in those kinds of environments. So, yeah, I think there's some really nice examples of learning around Indigenous fire stewardship at Dixon's Creek, and we can put that in some of the webinar materials.
Thanks, Bryony. There's been a lot of questions come through. One of them, I might point this to you, Nicola, to start, but Lee as well, you might want to reflect on this. The question that came through is, what would you say to educators that are scared of re-traumatizing their students by involving them in fire-related preparedness activities?
It's a genuine and legitimate concern. I think my response would be that we can re-traumatize people easily by asking them to go over events in an unsupported way or triggering them through imagery and so forth. So you do need to be mindful of that. Our aim is not to frighten or overwhelm people. However, the risk of not talking to them about it leaves kids to manage stuff on their own. And so it's always a balance between we don't want to show gratuitous images necessarily, or to have uncontained conversations of really overwhelming events, but talking in a contained, calm and practical, pragmatic way about what we can do to reduce risk, what we know and what is in place will bring anxiety down. So it's really important to be mindful of it, but not doing it doesn't make kids less anxious. It just leaves them to worry on their own without any reassurance. So that's my kind of theoretical answer, but Lee, I think, yeah, I'd love to hear his view on is with kids all day, every day. So yeah, over to you, Lee.
Thank you. I just want to reiterate what you're saying. I think the general question is, well, how do we deal with anxiety in schools? Where, you know, in my case, I'm still in primary school. I'm not a psychologist, you know. However, there's no good reason for not having a trauma-informed practice in the culture of the school, which means that we know that things are going to trigger our children to feel anxiety and experience what it means to have anxiety. And we will know in our culture, the way what it means to be, you know, a teacher in our community and a leader in our community, how to come alongside kids, how to have the conversation that de-escalates it, all the stuff we were talking about before, the skills of grounding, about breathing, and then allowing us to have that. My fear is that, do we cause trauma to happen by not preparing our kids to be able to move through what we know will be increasing seasons where we're more at risk of disaster through climate change. So by having a culture from day one, as Bryony was saying, our kids know we're going to be talking about, you know, disaster risk reduction, and our kids know they're going to have something to say, that they'll have a voice and they'll be heard and listened to. Does that help?
Yeah, thanks, Lee and Nicola. And we've had some questions coming through around the innovation and the kinds of problems that children have been able to identify and solve. And this might be a nice one for you, Bryony and Lee, to kind of explore with your work at Harkaway.
Yeah,
well,
sure.
if I just put the idea there about self-regulation, and Bryony, you can jump from there.
So some of the projects from Harkaway. One of the projects was by a group of students who wanted. The thing about Harkaway Primary School is it's actually located at the top of a really beautiful hill, and it looks down over quite a built-up area. And I was talking earlier about how children living in built-up areas are often quite unsure or underestimate their exposure to bushfire. So these children who come up to the school from the suburb down below were really unsure about whether they could actually be affected by bushfire and whether this is something they need to be worried about. And so they asked, could there be a bushfire in Berwick? And we were like, we don't know. See if you can find out. Go online, see what you can find. And they couldn't find anything. They couldn't actually find any information that could tell them whether or not they were at risk. So we made that their project. And they ended up designing a little pro bono consultancy table where they used the Vic Plan MapShare app and Google Maps, and they sat down with their classmates and they showed them if they were in a bushfire prone area or not. And the CSIRO scientists actually came to help them out with that at one stage, and they were like, this is fantastic, we need to do this for the whole community, not just for kids, because people just don't know if they're at risk.
So kids with high ability and high high self-regulation skills and teamwork skills were able to figure out what they're going to do and do it quickly. You know, when we're having these kind of conversations, everyone wants to present their glossiest, best, you know, everything was amazing and the kids did, you know, stuff that's never been done before. Well, there were some epic failures in there as well. So, you know, there are kids who were not able to achieve what we were hoping for them to achieve, and that's okay. At the same time, they took risks, and there's a heap of other learning that did happen, but it is incredibly complex, and we're structured in a way here that allows for that complexity and for that messiness and that, for that really sense of chaos to prevail for a while. You know, that's not the kind of culture where everything's going to be a box that gets ticked off every minute of the day. Hopefully, whoever asked that question, that goes somewhere. That answer.
Great.
Yeah, there's a lot coming here. We want to cover so many, so we might be able to add some resources at the end. Probably got time for a couple more. Anxiety is kind of coming up as a key theme, and I know we touched on that before, but are there any strategies, Nicola, that or Bryony or Lee, that you would recommend for helping kids manage anxiety around bushfires?
Well, I think in my practice, when I see clients and their main issue they present with is anxiety, is one of the first things I say is anxiety is absolutely awful, but it's actually one of the easiest things to learn the skills to manage when you know how to do it and you're supported to do it well. The defining characteristic of anxiety is feeling out of control. And that's an awful feeling. We've all felt it. We need to normalise it. As Lee was saying before we jumped on, that he was sharing with his students that he felt anxious about coming on today, modelling that it is a normal emotion and what he's going to do to manage that. I don't know about eating sugar was his strategy, but so I think we have to normalise it, that it is normal to be worried, and anxiety is an extension of that. However, regulation through breathing, and I always do just the basic physiology, because people will argue with you that breathing doesn't work, and it does. It's just you're not doing it for long enough or deep enough for it to work. So actually your physiology, it's not up for debate whether or not deep breathing will calm you down. It just does, because we know the systems. And I think that, you know, inquisitive nature and showing kids that, and you can get nice and gross with them about it if that helps, about, you know, when they're really hot and sweaty or whatever it may be. But the basic science of anxiety management takes away what anxiety breeds, which is uncertainty. So this definitely will help you manage your anxiety. But as I said before, you have to practice it when you're not anxious to use it when you are. And I talk about kids, you know, the same, a musical performance. If you have to rehearse it, so when you get into stage and go like that, your lines come out or your music comes out. If they're into sport, I say, look at what they do before they kick a conversion in the footy. They take a deep breath. Look at what they do before they serve. So you're bringing it into real life examples. Everybody is managing anxiety at regulation up and down all the time. So I think normalizing it, not shaming it, but saying you can have this, but we need to practice it. And there's hundreds of resources and tools: mindfulness, deep breathing, meditation, and recognizing some kids need to go up. You know, they need to kind of burn it off. Not everybody is going to get Zen to calm themselves down as well. So having different strategies.
So a really good example of that in the bushfire, in our safety committee. At our school, we've got 3 times the average number of kids doing life with a disability, being a smaller school. And so a lot of kids doing life with pretty significant anxieties. So our role is not to command and control. It's actually giving kids the space to do what they need to do. One student sat in the corner the whole time. Now, you know, we have our relationship, our relevance, and our rigor through all of that, but he would not be part of a group. And so it's like checking in every so often. In the end, he's really got this passion about, well, how do you help people with disabilities prepare for bushfire season? Because they're getting left out and they're getting put on a truck without a wheelchair and blah, blah, blah. And he's found an expert in a university and he's emailed off to them to, you know, find some answers. Here I was, he had nothing, he was doing nothing in the corner except playing the dinosaur game in Google. And it turned out he put everything in the subject line and not in the body of the email, but we got a response. And even, you know, he saw himself after that as someone who could find out and do something to help. And that was just extraordinary. So by not necessarily demanding compliance, but actually finding how do we come alongside and work with where it's at, then we had this incredible result for him.
Thank you, Lee.
Just one thing to really quickly to add in to what Nicola and Lee have said is that the work that Strathewen Primary School has done provides a really valuable model for how we might address some of children's bushfire-related anxieties when they have actually experienced an extreme bushfire event. And there are a lot of resources in the Emerging Minds toolkit, community trauma toolkit, that actually shows how Strathewen addressed some of those issues by providing children with that understanding of bushfire, because a lot of those children, I mean, that Black Saturday fire really, for that community, really came out of nowhere. And so the children actually learned that there are signs and signals in the environment that they can read to know where the level of risk is at different days. And that's hugely empowering for the children. And they actually had children that went from being so stressed that, you know, they were really, really struggling, to feeling really confident that they would actually be able to avoid, you know, a bushfire disaster in the future. So yeah, so definitely I'd highly recommend those resources that Emerging Minds have produced with Strathewen.
Thank you, guys, and Bryony and Lee and Nicola. We've just clocked over to 4, and I feel like we could talk for another hour together. So I really appreciate your time, and yeah, wanted to thank you for those insights that you've shared today. I really appreciate it. And we will attach resources, as you've all mentioned, for this ongoing conversation. And thanks to all the audience members who attended today. Keep an eye out for an email which will have all of those resources attached, as well as a link to this this webinar. We're planning another webinar in early next year, so keep an eye out for that as well. So thank you very much.